Beware the Ides of March. We've all heard it, right? It's honestly one of the most legendary warnings in all of Western literature, famously penned by William Shakespeare in his play Julius Caesar. It's one of those phrases that instantly conjures up these vivid images of betrayal, ominous prophecies, and of course, cold-blooded political assassination. But, well, before this phrase became a pop culture staple representing absolute impending doom, it was actually just a totally normal, regular day on the calendar.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're exploring the Ides of March, from picnics to political murder.
So, before we get into all the daggers in the high-stakes political drama, we really need to start with a fundamental question. What exactly was the Ides of March before it became this famous warning? To truly appreciate the irony of Julius Caesar's death, we first have to understand the everyday reality of the Romans who actually lived through it.
Let's start with Section 1, Decoding the Roman Calendar. Time in Ancient Rome.
Okay, so you see, the Romans didn't number each day of the month sequentially, from the first to the last like we do today. They actually counted backwards from 3 fixed anchor points in any given month. First up, you had the calends, which was always the first of the month. Then you had the nones, which fell on the 5th or the 7th. And finally, you had the Ides, or Ides. The Ides marked roughly the midpoint of a month. For most months, this was the 13th. But for March, May, July, and October, the Ides fell right on the 15th.
Now, originally, the Roman calendar was deeply tied to the lunar cycle. That means the Ides were supposed to sync up perfectly with the full moon. Plus, March, or Martius, named for their god of war Mars, was actually the very first month of the ancient Roman year until about the mid-2nd century BC. So in the earliest Roman calendar, the Ides of March was a huge deal. It would have been the first full moon of the brand new year. And actually, as a quick aside, this old calendar system is exactly why our modern months of September, October, November, and December, which literally translate to the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th months, no longer line up with their numerical names today. But practically speaking, the Ides was incredibly mundane. Because it was this fixed, predictable point right in the middle of every single month, it just naturally accumulated a bunch of practical, recurring chores. Most notably, the Ides was the day when your debt payments and your rents were due. Think about how we treat the 1st or the 15th of a month today. The Ides was basically the ancient Roman equivalent of rent day and paying off your credit card bill.
Moving on to Section 2, Rituals, Revelry, and Religion. The Holy Week.
Now, it wasn't all just paying bills. The Ides of every month were considered sacred to Jupiter, who was the Romans' supreme deity. On this day, the high priest of Jupiter, known as the Flamen Dialis, would lead what they called the Ides sheep in this grand procession right along the Via Sacra to the citadel, where the animal was sacrificed. But March specifically retained some special New Year's ceremonies. For instance, it was the occasion for the feast of Anna Perenna, a goddess of the passing year. And then there was also a really strange observance known as the Memuralia. Honestly, it was a day of just wild contrasts. On one hand, you have the Feast of Anna Perenna, which was enthusiastically celebrated by everyday people with these huge outdoor picnics, heavy drinking, and just general revelry. But then, on the other hand, you had the Memorialia. This was essentially a scapegoat ritual meant to physically represent the expulsion of the old year. And it literally involved dressing some old man in animal skins, beating him, and possibly driving him completely out of the city gates. So you can see the Ides of March was this chaotic, vibrant mix of holy sacrifice, drunken partying, and completely bizarre public rituals. And just to show you how this date continued to evolve, during the later imperial period, the Ides of March actually kicked off a full-blown Holy Week of festivals celebrating the great mother goddess Cybele and her consort Attis. March 15th was the day the reed enters, celebrating the birth of Attis. A week later, you had the tree enters, where priests, who were called tree bearers, would cut down a pine tree, hang an image of Attis on it, and dramatically mourn his death. This whole thing culminated on March 25th with a massive celebration of his rebirth. So these heavy concepts of life, death, and rebirth were deeply, deeply ingrained into this specific time of year, well after the Republic had already fallen.
Which brings us to Section 3, Beware the Ides, the climax of 44 BC.
60. That is the absolutely crucial number here. We're talking about the sheer scale of the conspiracy against Julius Caesar. As many as 60 conspirators were actively involved in this plot. And you have to remember, these weren't just random thugs off the street. These were elite Roman senators, led by high-profile, powerful figures like Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus.
Now, to keep a deadly secret among 60 politicians in a city as notoriously gossipy as ancient Rome, that is nothing short of a miracle. But they were all bound together by a very real shared fear. Caesar had recently won a brutal civil war, declared himself dictator for life, and they were terrified he was going to permanently destroy the Roman Republic.
So if we strip away all the mythology for a second, what you're really looking at is a meticulously planned ambush. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, Caesar was scheduled to attend a meeting of the Senate. But because the traditional Senate house had recently been damaged, this specific meeting was being held at a complex known as the Theatre of Pompey. And it was right here, completely surrounded by the men he genuinely believed were his peers, his friends, and his subordinates, that Caesar was swarmed and stabbed to death.
And this right here perfectly captures the chilling dramatic irony of the whole event, an irony that was famous way before Shakespeare ever got his hands on it. You see, the Roman historian Suetonius actually tells us about a real-life seer, a haruspices named Spurina, who had warned Caesar that harm would come to him, specifically on the Ides of March. On his way to the Theatre of Pompey that day, Caesar actually passed Spurina in the crowd and jokingly said, "Well, the Ides of March are come," basically mocking him and implying the prophecy was a total fake. The seer simply looked at him and replied, "Aye, they are come, but they are not gone." Literally moments later, Caesar was dead. Now, the conspirators, they proudly called themselves liberators. They really truly believed that by eliminating the dictator, the old traditional machinery of the Roman Republic would simply snap back into place and restore the balance of power. But as history shows us, the assassination achieved the exact opposite. It absolutely did not save the Republic. Instead, it opened its final and by far its bloodiest chapter.
Let's look at Section 4, the Republic's final chapter, the fallout. The fallout was essentially a devastating, fast-paced domino effect. In 44 BC, Caesar is murdered, which immediately triggers fresh civil wars across the Roman world. Fast forward 2 years to 42 BC, and the assassin Brutus is still actively fighting and actually takes the time to issue a coin celebrating his deed. By 40 BC, Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, is violently exacting his revenge. And finally, by 27 BC, Octavian achieves total sole power. He becomes the Emperor Augustus, permanently terminating the very republic that those assassins killed Caesar to protect. Let's talk about that coin from 42 BC, because it is just an incredible piece of historical propaganda. Issued by Brutus in the autumn of that year, this denarius literally brags about the assassination. If you look at the reverse side, it features the abbreviation Ides Mar, standing for the Ides of March. Right above that is a cap of freedom, which was a traditional symbol worn by emancipated slaves, positioned perfectly between two drawn daggers. They were intensely, openly proud of what they had done. They viewed it as a totally righteous act of liberation.
But, definitely not everyone saw it as a righteous act. Writing a bit later, under the reign of Emperor Augustus, the famous poet Ovid portrayed the murder not just as a dirty political crime, but as a severe religious sacrilege. Because you have to remember, Caesar wasn't just a secular political dictator. He was also the Pontifex Maximus, the chief high priest of all of Rome, and a priest of Vesta. To strike down Rome's high priest was seen by many as an unforgivable offense against the gods themselves.
And the gods, or at the very least Caesar's vengeful heir, demanded blood. This brings us to the incredibly chilling events of 40 BC. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, had just pulled off a major victory at the siege of Perugia against the brother of Mark Antony. To avenge his father's death, Octavian ruthlessly executed 300 opposing senators and equites. And he didn't just pick any random day. He chose a very specific date for this mass execution, the 4th anniversary of the Ides of March.
The sheer brutality of this act completely shocked Rome. In fact, historians like Suetonius and Cassius actually characterized this slaughter not just as an execution, but as a literal religious sacrifice. These 300 men were executed right at the new altar, built to honor the newly deified Julius Caesar. Remember earlier when we talked about the high priest sacrificing the Ides sheep to Jupiter? Well, 4 years after Caesar's death, the Ides of March featured a very different, deeply gruesome kind of sacrifice, entirely orchestrated for political vengeance. Which ultimately leaves us with a fascinating yet completely tragic paradox to ponder. Brutus, Cassius, and these 60 conspirators risked absolutely everything to save their beloved republic. But when we step back and look at the whole timeline, we have to ask, did killing a dictator simply guarantee the creation of an emperor?
By unleashing the chaos of the Ides of March, they ultimately paved the exact road that Octavian walked to become Augustus, the first true emperor of Rome. A day that literally started with rent payments and spring picnics ended up becoming the bloody, permanent dividing line between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the history behind the headlines.